Good afternoon. Coming to you live, 30 feet underground, but not as deep as Bernie Sanders was buried by the DNC. This is Austin.
And this is Carson.
And we are the Unelectoral College.
On today's episode, the good, the ad, and the ugly, we are covering a new wave of electoral ads with a guest speaker, Daniel Naples. Daniel Naples currently works for the Joe Biden campaign. We will also be getting a guest kind of presentation from Christopher Anderson. Christopher Anderson is a marketing major who understands a lot about electoral ads. He has worked for numerous campaigns, and he is currently serving as the Young Democrats president for the state of Ohio. Additionally, we will be discussing the news this week you may have missed,
Such as a peace prize for Donald Trump, more likely than you think.
and a new book called Rage.
Stay tuned. So, first order of business today, let's talk about this new wave of ads that came out recently. We had some for Biden, some for Trump, and some that are against Pelosi because, why not? For those of you watching us on YouTube, they will be in the description below. So let's start off with the Keep Up ad for pro-Biden. What is your opinion on this ad?
Well, first, before I talk about it, just for those of you who haven't seen the ad, it's basically just Joe Biden is able to keep up with what's going on in America. It shows him being very high energy, and it's a bit of a stab at Trump because there was a news story where Trump wasn't able to get down on the ramp by himself and couldn't drink water with one hand, you know. So that's kind of what he was going at here. Overall, I think it's an okay ad. I don't think it really shows too much of Biden as like a candidate. But I do think it's a good ad in the context that Trump is very classic in his political kind of conversations to be like, oh, Sleepy Joe, low energy, Bernie, all this kind of stuff. So that kind of like counteracts some of those Trump attacks, which I think has a bit of a okay kind of aspect to it. What about you?
I think the ad's very nice. It lacks, I feel, the punch in the gut that the next ad we discuss will have. At the end of the Keep Up ad, Biden goes through the civil liberties of yore, the protests, Martin Luther King and such. We'll talk about that more when we go over the next ad, which is the Meet Joe Biden supporter ad for Trump. This one's a little different. For those of you who haven't seen this ad, it covers the riots, mostly in Minneapolis, in a very violent light. It shows attacking police, breaking police windows, setting fires. I think we disagreed a little bit on this ad, on its effectiveness. I want to get your opinion on that again.
I think it was effective for like what Trump is trying to target. If the ad is used only to target Trump voters and to get them energized to go out to vote, I think it's going to be very successful. But if you're trying to use these ads to target swing voters in middle America, I really don't think it's going to work because Joe Biden also has ads out about this issue where he basically just says, all the clips that you're seeing in these Trump ads that are blaming me for the situation, I've been out of office for 4 years. The videos you're seeing in the ads are Trump's America. They're not Biden's America. And, as long as he keeps to that message, I think people who are middle of the road, who, don't really have that much of a partisan opinion are going to see Trump as just almost off the rails because he's trying to push every problem he's ever caused onto somebody else.
I do agree with your opinion on the back end there. My only concern, I guess not my concern, I'm fairly right-wing, so it's not really my, oh no. But I feel like middle Americans, those who are not very politically, I don't want to say educated, that feels kind of mean, politically out of touch.
Yeah.
Will see the ads and see the violence that Trump shows and just think, I don't want that. And in the Keep Up ad we mentioned, there is the civil protests of yore, where it seems like they're almost two sides of the same coin, where Trump's showing the negatives, the bad, the riots, the fires, whereas Biden's more showing like they're important, obviously. They're showing the importance of the civil liberties, what has been done with these kind of protests in the past. And it's kind of hard to argue against either side of those protests. I think it boils down mostly now is we're just, the government itself is not getting rid of enough of the rioters, but getting rid of too many of the protesters.
See, as now I'm more of on the liberal spectrum, which is why we're doing this podcast with Austin on the right, me on the left. I would agree that the government's kind of going after the protesters more than it should as a Trump kind of thing. But circling back to like the ad conversation, a Democrat hasn't won the majority of white America since Kennedy. And so when Biden is showing how great these marches are, you have to remember who he's targeting here. He's targeting Latinos, he's targeting African Americans, natives.
Votes, yeah.
And if Biden can get enough of the majority of the minority vote to turn out, he wins. We saw that happen with Abrams in Georgia, where it's a red state, but when the African American population got together and turned out to vote, she almost won. And if Biden can get large amounts of African American votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, it's over. That's all he needs.
One concern that I have for the Biden election, his kind of running thing, a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters were fairly younger, like collegiate age, freshmen, maybe even upper high school age. There's been a historic, not necessarily downturn, but historic absence of their voice in the vote. And I feel like that's going to be a struggle come the election time when they're trying to get the Sanders vote to just go for Biden, to get the young people to turn out, which they almost never do. For instance, back in the 2016 election with Clinton, she targeted heavily this young vote that just never came at all.
Even with Bernie, you look at Bernie here in the 2020 election cycle, he banked on that. And his youth voter turnout in 16 compared to 2020, it was lower. So even his strong voter base, people who were energized by him, still weren't consistent voters. So I'm also worried about that from a Biden standpoint. But I don't know how much of an issue it'll be, because I think targeting the African American voters is going to be more important than targeting the youth for this election.
Moral of the story, go out and vote, kids.
Yes.
If you're under the age of 21, go vote. It's great.
Almost every state currently is having some sort of vote by mail. I think there's about 10 exceptions. And you can get most of your voting guidelines on a Secretary of State's website with your state. For us in Ohio here, we would just type in Secretary of State, Ohio, and it would give us all the information we need.
Actually, I'm from Pennsylvania, so I have to take a mail-in ballot from the out of state. And I actually recently got approved for that only a couple days ago, so that's going to be fun. I can't wait to vote in my presidential election from the beautiful, luxurious Youngstown State University.
It'll be a fantastic time.
So let's get moving to the next ad. Which one do you want to cover next?
Let's talk about Pelosi a little bit.
Oh, which one?
Let them eat ice cream.
Let them eat ice cream. For those of you who haven't seen this ad, it's a very interesting one. It showcases a lot of the poverty and the hunger that lower America is currently going through, all the while showing her show off her glorious ice cream collection, where she talks about how she loves chocolate and how she does not know what she would have done if ice cream were not invented. This ad is strong, I think. It feels definitely like a what were they thinking kind of ad. It's very predictable. Like when I watched that segment in the news where Pelosi was going through the fridge, I'm like, how is this not going to come back against her? And it does. It definitely does. And I want to take this time now to mention probably my favorite take of the year. The ad mainly targets that there are like 22 million Americans in poverty / unemployed. And my favorite take of the year from Matthew Yiglius, a Harvard grad, saying, "Are people pretending to be mad at Nancy Pelosi for liking ice cream?" I don't know about you, but I like ice cream.
I
did not like
cream.
Pelosi in this ad, though.
No, and I think that's kind of the goal, which, I'm kind of on the fence about it, I've worked in a lot of government offices in my time here at YSU and through college, and, we almost expect these people to be gods. Who we're electing to these positions, but the simple fact of the matter is they're just people too. Biden stumbles on his words, Trump stumbles on his words, there's misinterpretation on both sides, and I think that's kind of what we're trying to do here at this podcast, is get through some of that, polarization a bit. I think we just need to recognize that people are people. I think that's very important.
Yeah, my biggest problem with not the ad, but with the segment of Pelosi, is it feels very tone deaf. There are 22 million people that are struggling. They're going check to check, and Pelosi's showing off her $24,000 worth of stocked fridge, her rows of ice cream, to an America that can't afford that luxury, that is suffering from, like I said, check to check, that needs this food, and Pelosi's just bragging about her chocolate.
Yeah, but you also got to consider on the same token, although we haven't seen an ad about it, how well do you think Donald Trump's
Right.
living in the White House?
Oh, yeah.
How well you think Pence is doing? You know, the Republicans are doing just as great as Nancy Pelosi is. You know, so like that's kind of a moot point, but I think what's really good about this ad, which I personally don't agree with, is that for whatever reason, we have targeted Nancy Pelosi as kind of this hatred symbol for the Democratic Party. If you can target Nancy Pelosi, which is exactly what this ad is doing, it brings down voter turnout across the entire nation for all Democrats.
It's a morale killer.
It's a morale killer. That's exactly the goal, and I think it's effective on that. And that's something I think you see only coming from the Republican side of politics is you create enough reasons to hate a person that even if the reasons to hate a person aren't true or accurate, you've heard it enough times that it just becomes ingrained in your body that, oh, I should hate Nancy Pelosi. Why do I hate Nancy Pelosi?
She got ice cream.
She got
ice cream. A lot of it. The worst part of the ad, Pelosi likes only pure chocolate ice cream. I don't like that.
You see, Joe is also a chocolate guy. The Democratic Party just loves them some chocolate ice cream.
I'm a big fan of vanilla ice cream. I like Neapolitan ice cream. I like raspberry and cranberry ice cream. But just pure chocolate ice cream just feels boring.
Unpopular opinion, I'm a big grape, big banana, big strawberry kind of guy. I like me some fruity ice cream.
Now that sounds all good together. That sounds like if you had them all together, it'd be really good.
Could be possible.
But switching from ice creams to mask and staying with Pelosi, one final ad against her. The ad we just titled "Rules for Thee, but Not for Me." Didn't have an official title. The ad showing Pelosi expunging her views upon the mask. And I'm going to say this now. I think the masks are great. I'm not anti-mask. Don't come after me.
I am also pro-mask.
We've got our masks in the booth. Not on because we're 20 feet underground. But as soon as we leave, they're going on. But it shows Nancy Pelosi constantly saying to wear the mask while she doesn't have the mask on. It shows her leaving the hair salon without the mask. And I think the biggest part of it that I took was her saying how leaders are supposed to take responsibility for their actions.
Yep.
And then she blames the hair salon. She says she takes responsibility for falling for a setup. All the while, the host of the hair salon is getting sent death threats, is getting sent mean messages, getting doxxed. This poor woman who just wanted to make her living after not getting money for who knows how long is being doxxed by Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
Just because Pelosi didn't wear a mask.
See, I agree with your entire kind of interpretation of this ad, and I think most of what we talked about with the previous Pelosi ad, applies to this one too, with the overarching Pelosi kind of things. The one thing I want to say about this issue that I think is important to bring up is Nancy Pelosi has been pro-mask for a very long time. And then she screws up, and now all of a sudden she's the hate target of this new ad. However, Donald Trump has been anti-mask for most of this cycle until he changed about a month ago, where he said, okay, now people should start wearing masks. And for whatever reason, when Nancy Pelosi was doing the right thing and made a mistake, it hurts her. But when Donald Trump was making a mistake and doing the wrong thing, it didn't impact him. So why are we targeting somebody who made a mistake with this mask issue once over the past, 4 months, when we have a man in office who's been making the mistake for 4 months and he's not getting the same kind of hate?
I think the main reason for this is almost, it seems hypocritical that Nancy Pelosi is just expunging her beliefs onto others, lecturing others about the mask. And even in the video, the ad, it shows her 2 hours after the hair salon without a mask lecturing on masks. Now, I don't agree with Trump not wearing the mask, but at least he's staying consistent with his idea like that. Yeah, he's changed recently, obviously. Thank goodness. Maybe a little too late, but we'll see. Hopefully it's gone by Christmas. But I feel like it just seems like she keeps preaching onto others about this mask thing. And a lot of times when she's saying this, she's also not wearing her mask.
Well, so part of the mask thing with you see on these things, and like I've seen a couple ads targeting Trump with it, which I know have been indoctrinated. You know, when you are giving a public presentation, as long as you're over 10 feet away, a mask isn't necessary.
Right.
And a lot of these leaders want their faces to be seen for, face recognizability, for election kind of ads, for
It's a symbol.
posters. It's a symbol kind of thing. So what you'll see with most of these elected officials is they will not have their mask on at any podium, but when they walk away from the podium, they will put the mask on.
But in one of the ads, it shows her pretty much in the crowd almost.
Yeah.
Like being interviewed by a news anchor. I don't remember who the news anchor was, but that's in there as well. I just feel like it's not necessarily the biggest issue. There are like more effective issues, like we talked about earlier with Americans in poverty, with the civil rights protests. The masks are important, but I feel like it's kind of should take a backseat almost at this point.
I agree it should be a backseat. I don't think it's that important of an issue. I think the poverty and the race issues are more important. But that's kind of the game that I think we're going to see a lot in these ads, is because if Trump tries to spend too much time talking about the race issues and talking about jobs, it makes him look worse because he can't really make a good, successful defense on a lot of those fronts.
Right.
I mean, he can make a policy standpoints and say in the long term, I'm going to help this country, look what I've done. But I think a lot of people who are still unemployed are going to be angry with the situation. I think a lot of people who are a minority, who've seen that these protests have been going on for months with no change, aren't going to be happy with that either. So I think that campaign strategy for Trump would be a failed one. So I think trying to go after like Nancy Pelosi and go after this mask thing, and another ad that you'll see classic is going after Bernie Sanders through Joe Biden. Even though Bernie Sanders is no longer running for president, somehow Joe Biden has gotten
Bears his way.
Yeah, somehow Joe Biden became Bernie Sanders overnight and like had a 180 on policy. So I think when Trump tries to go around the issue, I think that's his campaign strategy.
One thing I want to ask before we move on to our final ad from the Lincoln Project, I want to ask what your opinions are of how do you think the masks are going to affect the upcoming election in November? You think it's going to affect some of these key swing states, Pennsylvania, Ohio?
I think it is. I previously, for our listeners, worked at the Board of Elections here in Ohio. I have learned a lot about election law. We, as a Board of Elections, usually have sheriffs nearby to defend polling locations. And on top of that, we are allowed to ask people to leave. If you are wearing campaign merchandise, you cannot vote. If you are carrying a firearm, you cannot vote. So I think we're going to have a similar policy with mask. And I think it's going to be mandatory to have mask and voting in person. And I think people are going to come and they're not going to have a mask for whatever reason, because we still see it at grocery stores. And this person is going to be like, I want to vote. And me as a polling location person is going to have to say, sir, you have to leave, or I'm going to ask the sheriff to escort you out.
And while that seems like almost fair, right? It's going to be this huge issue. And they're going to bring up the First Amendment. They're going to bring up the Fourth Amendment. I worked as a cashier and a customer service manager at Walmart in a small Pennsylvania town, and I got yelled at on loop about these mask things. And I'm like, nothing I can really do about it. Just wear the mask, people. It's not too hard.
And I think one of the biggest things is especially if these swing states come down to a couple thousand votes like they did in 16, if Donald Trump can pull at least 100 people who were turned away in Ohio or Pennsylvania for not being able to have a mask, he can claim a major election issue there because we stop people from voting 100 times. And if we're within a couple thousand votes, those 100 votes really matter. And that could be a huge, huge, huge court case.
Yeah, and I mean, you see it now. It's probably just be accentuated after this voting election if people are turned away from their mask. They're already mad about not being able to go shopping for their chocolate ice cream on their mask, but it's the way it is right now. I think it probably has less of an effect in some states like Florida. I feel like Floridians don't seem to be too keen on the mask. You saw the headlines a few months ago where they're all not protesting but celebrating on the beach, no masks. It's unfortunate. It's why it's still around. But what are you gonna do? I can tell you what you can do. Wear the mask. Yep.
All right, let's talk about this last ad.
Un-American from the Lincoln Project talks about Donald Trump's insults and heckling towards the military. Calls them losers, calls them suckers. I don't really have an excuse for this one as a right-leaning person. I can obviously talk about the context. The suckers one I think is a little unfairly context because he's talking about how some military officials were suckered into this deal, but there really isn't an excuse. It's just Trump being a meanie.
Yeah, the big thing I think about this ad is it's the ads that I would like to see from Joe Biden.
Right.
Because Joe Biden's ads, were a stab at Trump for walking down, a thing, but he needs to focus more on some of these, things where Trump is really screwed up, which I think is good that the Lincoln Project is stepping in and doing that for him. I think that helps his campaign out a lot.
The concern that I have with it, though, is it's this third-party source, the Lincoln Project on YouTube. I don't believe they have any other locations that they stream their ads to. Is how many people is this reaching for the election? Because it could be some guy in Europe writing, watching, talking his opinion, and that's something you see a lot on social media. I hate to bring up Reddit, but here we go. The mostly liberal-leaning Reddit versus the mostly right-leaning Facebook. You see these people who have a very skewed idea of their worldview, bring up their opinions on X, Y, and Z. Some of the people that are bringing these opinions forth have maybe never even been to the United States. They may be mostly European and such. And not to say that opinion's not valid, but when it spins this story up and up and up, it can kind of get misleading.
Yeah.
It can be dangerous.
And that's how the Russians did their quote-unquote interference in 2016,
Right.
It's all social media based, bots sharing articles, that kind of thing.
And you see it even now. You see, I think it's on Facebook. It might be on Twitter. I think I linked you one on Twitter. Political campaigns are using the accounts of dead people to almost advertise their campaign. Like Herman Cain, I believe his name was, who died like a few weeks, month later, tweeted something about...
Yeah, COVID.
Right.
He died of COVID and then tweeted something about how COVID was being over-exaggerated.
Now that's an effect. COVID can resurrect the dead. Crazy,
Yeah.
huh? It's crazy how far it's come.
Uh,
Wear the mask. Don't get resurrected. Bad idea.
all right, are we ready to call in our special guest?
Calling a guest who probably knows a little more about these ads than we would. Maybe not about these specific ads, but ads in general. And to fill the void, let's talk about ice cream. More specifically, vanilla ice cream. Because I think people who like chocolate ice cream don't have expanded taste enough, even though vanilla is the basic flavor.
Hey, Dan, you ready for
But you never know.
All right, so we have Dan Naples on the phone. Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Dan Naples. I'm I guess you could say a progressive activist, northeastern Ohio. Worked on a whole bunch of different campaigns, congressional, presidential. It's kind of got my work started around 2017, 2018. Native from Youngstown, Ohio, and other than that, that's, I guess, kind of a summary of it, yeah.
So right now, it's me and Austin, and we are talking about campaign ads. I gave you a little bit of a heads up before this call. So we're just going to ask you a couple questions about what you think the campaign ads are this season. So what do you think Joe Biden's campaign ad strategy is?
I think his campaign strategy, like, I don't really know how to describe it specifically, but it's much more targeted. To if we're like selling a product, say it's very consumer based. It's really targeting in the areas that are affected by the advertising. So Ohio ads specifically are targeting for Ohio voters, whereas in sometimes years past, the presidential ads can be kind of on net a little bit more too general. That was a big problem, at least in 2016. But that's how I would summarize Biden's so far ad strategy.
And then what about Trump's?
Trump is very similar, and actually, to give props to the Trump campaign, was very good at this consumer or voter-style targeting at individual states to individual issues and really doing a grassroots approach. But I would like to also add in that for the Trump campaign has been more so very heavy on all fronts for their advertising, specifically on gaining basis on the social media aspect of things, kind of for more so their targeting, whereas the Biden campaign, I would say, is doing a more traditional approach to the marketing of where specifically they're finding out like what voters would want.
All right, so you mentioned the Biden strategy, Trump strategy, so I'm assuming that you've seen some of the ads that came out recently. Has there been any advertisements that you've seen that's really just blown you away with how good or even how bad it was on either side?
Yeah. So, and specifically, I really liked it was a Biden ad, and it was more so doing for it was a COVID response ad, and it really wasn't saying all too much, to be frank. Like, it really was just more so saying things are going to be all right if you elect Joe Biden. The impressive thing I want to say for that is that in my head, as I go to school for business and I'm even taking a marketing class now, it gives me, as a voter, it's connecting Biden with security, which is one thing I found that, the Trump campaign is really stressing for a lot of their ads. And they're doing the inverse. I've actually seen, I would say a little bit less successfully, where it was the ad it's a 911 call for an old woman about no police are picking up, and the phone operator says, sorry, in Joe Biden's America, we defunded the police. And it shows the old woman screaming and getting scared. And that kind of also, that connected it though more so towards a policy. But I still think they're both effective since they're very similar ad strategies. So it's really connecting emotions to both of the candidates.
Who do you think ad strategy is winning out right now? Who do you think is going to be leading in most of these swing states?
So in particular for swing states, I think it varies across the country. I think right now for Ohio, Trump is probably right into a little bit ahead. I would say for the Southwest, so somewhere like Arizona, I would say Biden is more ahead. Florida, I would give to Trump. Specifically because of these advertisements, they're changing a little bit more so on policy. I would say, though, across primarily Midwest swing states, though, outside of Ohio, so example, Michigan and PA, more so for Biden, with his ads there have been, I've seen a handful of them that are a little more on the nose, I know, with PA voters for their more specific issues, such as like coal mining and some of the factory issues there.
Let's see.
I got one last one here for you, Dan. You've been on the ground here for a lot of these campaigns. With the whole coronavirus thing going on right now, do you think these ads are going to be like the main mechanism of campaigning during this kind of election cycle, or do you think ground operations are going to be still useful?
So, I mean, to be frank, if I knew for sure, I'm not all too sure. But what I can say is, though, I think it was even before Corona, that these ads, just in general advertising, since we now as human beings, we spend so much more time consuming media with our phones, I think advertisements like this are going to be the way in the future, past Corona or not. Ground operations, though, are still going to be crucial because we can kind of you can run as many advertisements in the world. But if you don't have a good coordinated ground set up to really talk to voters one-on-one, stuff doesn't really work out. And the example I want to give for this is actually Michael Bloomberg. He ran a very strong ad campaign for a good amount of time, too, set up across the entire country for the Democratic primaries. And they were solid advertisements. I mean, it's Michael Bloomberg. The man's run billion-dollar corporations. He's one of the richest men in the world. He had more than enough money to buy quality advertisements, but he didn't do it early enough to set up solid ground operations, and that reflected in the vote, where I believe he only gained around 5% of delegate votes from his Super Tuesday. So while advertisements are massive, I think for the primary, for the general, at the end of the day, it needs to be a huge coordinated offensive on both fronts, pretty much. And that you can't do one without the other.
I don't have any more questions, actually.
I don't. I think we are good on questions, Dan. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me.
Have a good day. So, he brought up something that I think we can talk about now. Before we talk about the articles we brought up, let's talk about swing states. Obviously, as we get closer to November, we'll be talking about it a little more in detail. We got a lot of swing states, some of them in 2016 that could flip. You got Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, the obvious ones. There's Wisconsin, Michigan. Some people think Texas might go blue. I personally don't believe that. I think Texas is going to stay red.
Georgia, possibly.
Georgia. You've got, let's see, I mentioned Wisconsin, I believe.
Yeah, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, PA, Arizona,
right.
Nevada, Florida, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina.
Which ones do you think are most likely to flip come November?
We've already seen Arizona flip.
Right.
So I think Arizona is a given to Joe Biden. I think that's going to be a strong for him. I think Ohio is going to stay red. I think North Carolina is going to stay red. I think Florida will stay red. And I think Joe Biden is going to flip Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
That's kind of my thoughts, too. From what I've seen a lot, especially on campus, it feels like the thing with Trump that's hard to gauge, and the thing why polls sometimes aren't like as great, is when it comes to Trump voters, either everyone kind of knows you're voting for Trump or nobody does. You're either very outspoken or you're not telling anybody that you're voting for Trump. It's very hard to gauge this, and I believe it was Nixon that said the silent majority.
Yes.
They might come back this election. We'll see.
See, I think the silent majority is what won Trump in 2016 for sure. But I think the people who silently voted for him in 2016 are more likely to be sick of him than they were in that year. So I think your silent majority, if it still works, is going to most definitely be weaker than it was in 2016.
I don't have any arguments on that. I feel like a lot of the election will come down to these last few months. I feel like we've got a lot of stuff brewing.
And the ads are very important for that. Your states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, we get saturated with them. They are every YouTube ad. They are every TV commercial spot. You know, so these ads are going to be not only crucial in opinion turning, they're also going to be crucial in quantity, and it could also be crucial in the other way where it could be burnout.
Right.
A lot of voters in this area get burnouts because they see too many ads. So it's important to target specifically.
I think especially coming November, we always have 2 months left. A lot's still up to stake. I figure these ads could make that difference because it's likely that, say, Ohio or Pennsylvania, more likely than Ohio, could win by like 2 points, 3 points. It can be a very close contested race all throughout. If you recall the 2016 election, Pennsylvania, for instance, was too close to call for most of the night. And then at the back end of it, they called it red.
Yep.
That could happen again. But-
or we might not even get election results at all on election night.
Maybe not. There's a lot of controversy and drama coming up. It's gonna be an interesting few months. That's for sure. Stay tuned for that.
Speaking of controversy and drama, would you like to start us off on our next piece of news?
The Nobel Peace Prize. You know it. You've heard the name. Everyone from Hitler to Mother Teresa has been nominated for this prize. And now, for the second time, Trump is getting a nomination. This one comes from Norway. The man who puts him up for the ballot, Christian Tybrig Jed. We're going to try that as a pronunciation. Nominated him. And I want to bring up this article by The Atlantic, which is a little clickbaity, little of that clickbait culture. They hit the title of Cancel the Nobel Peace Prize, or End the Nobel Peace Prize, sorry. And their description is, the Trump nomination shows that peace had its chance and it blew it. That's a little misleading, because the article mostly talks about how the writer wishes for skip years of sorts, where the Nobel Peace Prize just says, nobody's earned it this year, we'll move on to the next year, keep it locked away. And they call the election almost trollish, trolling. They mentioned how trolls are a Scandinavian invention. I don't really agree with that. I think it's kind of a bad take. I feel like, without getting too much into the UAE-Israel deal yet, I feel like it is very good strides for lasting peace in that region. Do I agree with this man's take that this is just malarkey? No, not really. I believe there's a grounds for it. But my argument is, I think it's a little early to just put him up on that ballot. I feel like we should give it a couple weeks, see how this deal goes. It could fall apart in record time, or it could be greater than anyone expected, pull in everyone sooner.
Without talking about the UAE deal specifically, my take on the article is twofold from my interpretation. The first thing that I think about it is I think not having a Nobel Peace Prize every year creates additional value for what the Nobel Peace Prize is. Because if we look at the Doomsday Clock, they are a great organization that talks a lot about a lot of issues coming with peace and stability in the world that we live in. And we are very close to midnight on their kind of calculations with this. Granted, there's been steps towards peace, but overall, as a world, we are in probably one of the most unpeaceful times of the modern era. And so I think making a statement and being like, maybe we should not have a Nobel Peace Prize this year would be kind of a good idea.
It would be an eye-opening thing.
It'd be an eye-opening thing. It'd be an attention grabber to a lot of issues that need more attention. The other thing I would like to say about it is the article talks about why could Trump possibly get a Nobel Peace Prize. And the thing that I think is most important to talk about with this is I think we need to start as a society addressing more duality of people. Because although I hate Donald Trump, I think he is one of the worst presidents we've had in this country. Does that mean that disqualifies him from a Nobel Peace Prize? Can you be an awful person and still accomplish something for peace?
I mean, you figure if we're doing the Nobel Peace Prize example, Hitler was nominated back then, but that was kind of satirical. Mm-hmm. It was more like, hey, look at this guy, you know?
I mean, I think the whole kind of concept of a Nobel Peace Prize, in essence, is kind of a duality statement. The reason why we have the Nobel Peace Prize is it's named after Mr. Nobel. And Nobel is the inventor of dynamite. And he created the Nobel Peace Prize on the idea that when we destroyed so much with dynamite and killed so many people, that this was his way to kind of fix the situation he caused. So the idea that the Nobel Peace Prize was built on a man who did so much wrong in his own opinion to being something that talks about something that we can do right, I think is important to mention that maybe, even though Trump is an awful person, maybe he should be nominated.
Like, that shouldn't immediately just be like, no, cut him out of the conversation, such and such. I wanted to mention, the article also brings up Kissinger, who really wasn't the most peaceful person. He only really ended a singular conflict, but he was a very conflictious person. He didn't really do much for peace outside of near the end, and that's kind of what everyone was like, oh, look at this. It's more of a, I don't want to say a hero complex that drives a Nobel Peace Prize, where people are driven not for their goodness to help, say like the Red Cross or Doctors Without Borders. People just kind of see this and they're like, I want a Nobel Peace Prize, so I'll do this near the back end, make it look better, button up the resume.
Now, getting more into specifics on this UAE deal, I am a huge Israel supporter. I've been to the country. I think it has a lot of great potential. Some of the things that I have issues with is Donald Trump earlier made the deal of the century, where he said he was going to end the Israeli conflict. And what he did with that was he created a deal that was rejected by almost every single Muslim majority country, even the Palestinians, even a large proportion of Jewish voters were not a fan of his deal of the century. His original attempt at peace was a failure and one-sided. And so I think part of this UAE deal, it just doesn't leave me in a good place, because like I know what he tried to do and now I know what he got. And so I feel like when you do something and you're like very pro-Israel, anti-Muslim nations, and then suddenly you come up with a police plan part 2, I think that's something to kind of raise eyebrows about, because are we truly creating a peace deal when the man's original idea was a failure? And the other kind of thing I want to say with this is, although the UAE negotiation has also led to the Bahrain deal, I think is important. The other thing I want to say is that Israel was never really at threat from the UAE or Bahrain. Most of Israel's threats came from Egypt and Jordan, which was already dealt with. The other threats mostly now come from Iran and Syria and Lebanon, with Lebanon not being the Lebanon country, but specifically, the terrorist organization within there. So I mean, I understand it's a step in the right direction towards peace, and I think it is going to benefit both Israel, UAE, and Bahrain, but I wouldn't call it like the
best
peace
thing
deal
ever.
of the century,
Right.
because Israel was never at threat from these countries. And the last kind of critique I have with this, my third critique, is that going back to my original point, how Trump has shown himself to be kind of pro-Israel, anti Palestine in most of his dealings. This UAE deal does end illegal Israeli settlements, which is great for the Palestinians. But at the same time, the Palestinians still aren't supporters of the deal. They were never included in this peace negotiations. And I think that's something to do, that they need to be included, especially because part of the reason this peace deal needed to be done was because Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Trump provided more aid to Israel. Trump has been building up a lot of Israel, and he's created a lot of the problems facing these Palestinians, and then he leaves them out of the conversation.
Yeah, it feels almost as if the Palestinians get kind of left behind and forgotten about in the rain for that one.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons I feel a little hopeful about the deal is because the UAE kind of opened its eyes and said, like, yep, we're going to be willing to try this. We're going to be giving it a go. They're kind of interested. And I want to ask you this question. Let's say, hypothetically, let's jump a few months into the future. Let's jump to pre-November, before the election. Let's say that this trade deal works. It works perfectly. Not the trade deal, the peace deal, my bad. But with this deal working, it could entice other Middle Eastern countries to come forward into an idea like this. For instance, you go Oman, Sudan, Saudi Arabia even, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that come election time, I personally don't believe Biden would be able to keep the momentum in the Middle East with this? Would you think, if that was the potential outcome, would you trade 4 years of a second Trump term for these countries like Oman, like Sudan, Saudi Arabia, to join this peace deal is it almost worth it?
So here's the thing, which is part of the issue with this peace deal, with the Palestinians being left out of the conversation. The more Muslim majority nations that acknowledge Israel, the less cards the Palestinians have to play with. So assuming that this peace deal works the way Trump wants it to, Palestine will lose UAE, they will lose Bahrain, they will lose Saudi Arabia as allies. And with that in mind, Israel wants nothing but recognition. Because if they can be recognized, they can continue to be a country.
Right.
So if all these countries start recognizing Israel, the Palestinians lose one of their largest bargaining chips. And if they lose this bargaining chip, there could possibly be no true peace because the Palestinians aren't being given their fair share.
Right.
So that's kind of one of my major concerns. Like, the UAE deal will work to create peace between Israel and UAE, but it will not work to create peace between Israel and Palestine,
yes.
which is what the main focus needs to be.
That's got to be worked on, right? And let's go back to the original Nobel Peace Prize topic. Do you think it's fair to include him as a nominee this upcoming cycle?
I think it's fair to include him. I don't think he'll get very far in the selection process.
I don't think he'll win either.
But I think it's fair to include him, especially because, we're just talking about this one, but he also did a deal with Korea. He's had that, at least an attempt. He's also worked with Serbia and Kosovo. And they've now normalized relations within this last week, which is another Trump accomplishment. So I think he deserves to be in the list. I don't think he'll get it.
Yeah, I feel like, again, Trump's not going to win the Peace Prize. Mm-hmm. For better or for worse, it's not going to happen. I'll give you that right here. I think it's, of course, like you said, it's definitely fair. He's done a lot. But saying he's going to win, it's kind of not tone deaf, but like blind-ish, I guess. I guess it depends on who else is up there, but we'll never know. Yeah. We won't know for 50 years. So, speaking of the next article, the one you wanted to bring up, on Bob Woodward's new book, Rage, his tell-all almost about Trump from his experiences with him. Blow me away.
The article I specifically use comes from the New York Times. It's a summary of what comes out of this book. The main takeaways this article says we need to be paying attention for is, first, Trump purposely downplayed the virus to prevent a panic. The second one is that two of Trump's former cabinet members have said not only that he's, awful at leading, blah, 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 but they've said that he is dangerous to the stake of democracy in this country and the stability of the United States. That is a very frightening kind of concept if it's true. The third point is that Trump had no empathy for African Americans. Woodward, I guess, interviewed Trump and asked him a couple questions about, why do you think African Americans feel this way? Have you heard of this issue? And Trump has said, no, I did not hear of these issues. I don't think it's important. I think it's fake news, classic Trump rhetoric. So he was not even willing to really have a conversation about race. And then the last major takeaway was Trump and Kim Jong-un's interpersonal relationship with one another.
What does Mr. Un describe it as? Mr. Kim, a romantic fantasy?
Yes. Mr. Trump described Mr. Kim as a fantasy film, and I quote, "You meet a woman, in 1 second, you know whether or not it's going to happen." He said he felt a similar chemistry with Kim, not in the romantic sense, but in the feeling that he knew they were going to be instant best friends.
Wouldn't that be a news article if it was in that romantic sense? President Kim Jong-un, President Trump, sitting in a tree. Diplomacy.
You very clearly haven't read enough fan fictions. Those already exist.
I mean, I've seen some art not even an hour ago. Courtesy of you showing me some very interesting media regarding Trump and Hillary. But let's talk about this book.
Yeah.
I feel it's kind of ignorant to excuse the behavior of Mr. Trump, right? Like, if obviously I have not seen the interview, so I'm not going to parade as if I have.
And most of us haven't yet because the book isn't out yet.
If Trump really is like saying that he doesn't have empathy for African Americans, there's no real excuse for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I haven't seen it, so don't take this as a word. If it's being twisted in some way towards that as the conclusion, it's a little more iffy. Like I mentioned this earlier with the Lincoln ad, they talk about how he calls military officials suckers, and I feel like that's very cherry-picked, very out of contexted, because he's talking about how they were suckered into a deal, not necessarily they were suckers. Of course, I don't have an excuse for some of the other rhetoric, but sometimes it feels a little picked off of the vine.
One of the things that I'll say about this, I think a lot of the criticisms in the book are probably accurate and important, but Trump is such a controversial figure, and he has had so many things come out of his administration that are just absolutely mind-blowing about his failures, about his temper tantrums, about all these kinds of things, that it almost feels like a tell-all book is almost kind of pointless.
Part of the story.
Because, like, what can he tell us
That hasn't been
that
said
already hasn't
right.
been said, you know? Mattis resigned and he said bad things about Trump. Now, granted, this book, for the first time, says that Mattis claims Trump is a dangerous threat to democracy, but Mattis said that before Trump was awful, you know, and then
Right.
Trump says he's downplaying the virus. Well, I kind of thought he was downplaying the virus because, you know, Democrat governors had the tendency to be more strict compared to Trump and his Republican allies, you know, so there was definitely a disconnect there. Fauci and Trump have gone at it several times, you know, so like downplaying isn't something really new.
Going back to the mask issue and the policies passed, while Trump does obviously shoulder some of the blame, I feel a lot of it isn't necessarily him. It's some of the people that are not necessarily voting for him, but in these rural areas. I'll go back to my anecdote from Le Walmart
Yeah.
Supercenter. There was a state mandate that basically stated you have to have a mask outside and inside the store, and not even half the people would wear a mask. And there's not. I don't really think there's too much Trump can do about that at that point, because there's already these mandate. The law passes in Pennsylvania, and these people are just ignoring it because my freedoms.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of what Woodward's argument would be if we had a full text, is that, you know, Trump encourages non-mask wearing behavior. At least he did. And now that he's done so, even though he's pro-mask now, it's almost too late.
Yeah.
My Facebook feed, I'll tell you personally, is full of tons of conspiracy theories about masks don't work. And microchips. And the biggest thing that I have with it is it's almost like they can't figure out which propaganda and which conspiracy theory they want to go with. Because I've seen people who share articles saying that the mask causes you to get coronavirus because you keep breathing in your own breath. But then at the same time, they say coronavirus isn't real. And then they say coronavirus is not a threat, therefore we, you know, can't, you know, or we have to have in-person voting, you know, because coronavirus isn't a threat. But then, you know, at the same token, it's enough of a threat that Trump has to cancel portions of the RNC. And they're like, well, Trump's just trying to keep us safe, you know? So, like, these conspiracy theorists don't seem to have a concrete story almost anymore.
Well, it's just because they're just conspiracy theories,
Yeah.
not based in reality.
Yeah,
Like that first
exactly.
one you mentioned, where you're breathing in the mask, gives
Yeah,
you the
makes-
coronavirus. If that happens, it's because you have the coronavirus.
Yeah.
Who would have thought? Speaking of these conspiracy theories, not necessarily conspiracy theories, but the anti-maskers. In Facebook, I saw this one recently. Some woman was comparing Trump to the devil because he's working with the masks now. He said, I will never give my God-given body a mask. Can you imagine? You wear clothes, but you're not going to wear a mask. You can wear a scarf in the winter. You going to wear a mask in the winter? I am.
When I'll tell you a quick story. It was 2016 election cycle. I'm a Methodist for religion. I went to a church mission trip. This woman came in to the church and she said, I was feeling a little sick today, but I felt like I had to be here. God was telling me I was going to save somebody today. And my pastor was like, oh, good for you, love Jesus, all that stuff. And she asked my pastor if there was anybody who had a very strong interest in politics.
Uh-oh.
And he said, of course, Carson does. And so she came over to me and she said, God told me that I had to be here. I was sick, but he told me I had to be here to save you. Who are you voting for?
Uh-oh.
And I told her Hillary Clinton. And she said, oh, the Lord is working in mysterious ways. I'm here to save you.
You fool.
And she went off on me for like 2 hours. It was an experience.
That sounds like fun. I haven't had any experience like that. I'm apatheistic, which is basically a very nice way to say I don't care.
As you should.
If the apatheistic thing is I don't really worship a God, I don't know if there is one, but if there is a God, he will respect my virtue and not my prayer. And if there's not a God, at least I lived well. I think we're in a simulation, my friend.
Interesting.
You never know.
So is there anything else that you think is important about this book?
From the book? Nothing crazy, nothing we haven't heard before. It brings more issues, obviously, to the limelight, but it almost feels at this point like you just add it to the pyre,
Yeah, one last thing I think I want to say about this book is I think every single portion of these main talking points is a threat, and I think Trump is probably guilty of most of these. But the first interview that Woodworth did with Trump was on February 7th of this year.
Yeah.
It is now, September 12th is when we are doing this podcast. And the article that I'm using for this was published on September 9th. It feels to me that if you have this atrocious information about this man who is running for president, who is a threat to our democracy, who loves Kim Jong-un for no reason other than that they're good pals, who may or may not hate African American communities, who is a threat to our democracy. If you have this information, why is it coming out in a book?
7
which we will have
months.
To pay for 7 months later. Why aren't we, Woodward was famous for the Nixon gates, or the Watergate scandal with Nixon. He was the one who uncovered all this information. He's a trusted
source.
So why shouldn't he be telling the American people, Donald Trump is this atrocious person, here's how I know, here's my op-ed for the Washington Post. Why is it suddenly, come buy my book at Barnes & Noble's for, whatever price it ends up being to learn about these things you may or may not have heard of already, but I have extra information that is really going to, ruin his presidency.
And one thing I wanted to mention, this is a little different than what I was going to talk about in the Atlantic article. It almost feels like as November's coming, people on both sides are getting more urgent, obviously, because the election's coming. It almost feels like it's starting to sweep people away. People are getting lost in the commotion. They're just getting excited. Which is something I want to bring up, is to be careful of your sources coming soon. Mm-hmm. Because as we get closer and closer, it's more and more likely people are going to be trying to swing you one way or the other by saying things like, masks were made by the devil, and if you wear them, you will die in 6 days, or something like that. You're going to get chain emailed.
And part of what we're doing this podcast for, and I hope you've learned this over the time you've spent talking to us, is that, I'm a Biden supporter. I'm a hardcore Democrat, have been my entire life, worked for the congressman, but at the same time, you heard me maybe 10 minutes ago say that Trump should have been nominated for the Peace Prize. So, with that in mind, it is what it is. You have to kind of read through what you have and discuss it with people of different political ideologies, which is what me and Austin are doing.
That would be me. I am the different ideology. I'm not really too hot on Trump. I'm obviously right-wing, conservative. I'm red. But as we get closer to the election, it's more important to realize that there's different people out there, there's different views, everyone's going to be thinking differently, especially coming in the election. And one thing I wanted to mention as well regarding media, not necessarily like, oh, this media is biased. A lot of times your view is going to be kind of discouraged regardless of what view you take. People who are louder than you about your view might try to silence that view. Keep with it. Keep with whatever view you have.
All right, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the bell for more notifications on our channel. Uploads every Saturday.
Stay safe.
Don't do drugs.
Don't die.
Stay in school.
Tell your mom you love her.
Wear a mask. Got another one?
Nope.
Have a good night, everyone. This has been the Unelectoral College podcast.